How can Canadians attempt to hold our government accountable when that same government has routinely displayed irreverence and contempt for even the concept of accountability? Well, one of the few legal ways that is still available to us as Canadians, for now, is through the courts. Well, my next two guests are leading the fight against our government and our country's most powerful institutions to hold them accountable for what they did to Canadians during the Freedom Convoy. Eddie Cornell, a man who served our country in uniform for over 22 years, along with his lawyer Blair Ector, have just filed a multi-million-dollar lawsuit against Justin Trudeau, several members of his senior cabinet, along with his national security staff, Canada's 5 major banks, along with several credit unions, the RCMP, the Ottawa Police, and the Canadian Anti-Hate Network. 20 plaintiffs are seeking from the above-mentioned defendants over $2 million in damages. Now, each defendant in this case had their bank account unconstitutionally frozen, and several defendants are alleging that they were victims of police brutality. What Justin Trudeau's government did after declaring a public order emergency against the Freedom Convoy impacted thousands of Canadians. But our next guests are leading the charge to make sure that what happened in February of 2022 never happens to a Canadian again. Well, we're now pleased to be joined by Eddie Cornell and Blair Ector. Thank you both so much for coming on. Eddie, I want to begin with you. I want to go back to February 14th, 2022, when Justin Trudeau declared a public order emergency on the Freedom Convoy as the world was watching. And you were in the middle of Ottawa. You were in the middle of the Freedom Convoy. And first, I want to just go to you and ask you, what compelled you to join the protest, and what happened to you when Justin Trudeau invoked the Emergencies Act?
Well, what compelled me to join was I realized that, what the government was telling people didn't add up. It didn't make sense, that truckers, for example, who sit all day in their own truck and really don't bother anybody, had to be mandated to take a vaccine. And, we'd been locked down long enough and things just didn't make sense to me. So I knew when I saw the trucker convoy starting to assemble and heading to Ottawa, I knew I had to be there.
And when Justin Trudeau invoked the Emergencies Act, take us through how you came to realize that you no longer had access to the money you earned because of your service to our country.
Well, what happened was, on the Friday after it had been invoked, I went to a cash point and, because you don't really carry a lot of cash, most people like myself, we use our debit cards. So I needed to take out some cash for a couple of things, and it rejected me. And I was like, that can't be right. And so I thought, well, I'll have to deal with that in the morning. So that next morning, Saturday morning, I decided, I'd give the bank a call. And I got really vague information from an agent on the other end telling me to call the president, and they couldn't give me any information, and my accounts just wouldn't show up. And it got me pretty concerned, I can tell you that.
So you were able to actually get in contact with the bank president? I mean, that seems like they want you to go all the way up to the chain, to the very top of the bank. Was that a story similar to your other co-plaintiffs in this case?
Well, I can't speak for them, but in my case, they didn't provide me with any information how I could speak to the president. It was really vague. I don't think they had a call like that in the past, and I wasn't getting anywhere. And I was like, well, what president do I call? And you have to call the president of the bank. So I said, well, what can that do? Like, how come I can't access my money? And they said, well, we're not able to give you that information on the telephone. And I realized it was a pointless conversation. So I took some screenshots of, what had taken place with my account, and I saved those, and they're pretty vague. So, yeah, I was really concerned because I had a lot of money in there, and everything I had was in that one bank, and it was gone. There was no record of it.
So all of the other co-plaintiffs in this case, they all had their bank accounts frozen. Now, I imagine that when you have your bank account frozen, and once it becomes unfrozen, that's not the extent of the damage that happens to it. So, I mean, I'm sure that's just the beginning in a long series of events that impacts your financial health. So, what happens to you when your bank account gets frozen like this?
Well, first of all, I needed money to travel home. I live in New Brunswick, and it's about 1,800 kilometers from Ottawa. So, I had to count on the kindness of others to give me some cash so I could get home. And, coming through Quebec, which seemed to have more draconian rules than some of the other provinces, they wouldn't take cash at a lot of the gas stations that I had to stop. So it was quite an event. And when I did get home, you know, I realized, this is bad. And I tried to go to a couple other banks to possibly open an account there, and they said it's not really a good idea to do that. So I realized I must have been on some kind of list. To this day, I don't know what that list is, but I haven't been able to move anything to different banks at this point.
Wow. Well, Blair, I want to move over to you, and I want to just get a summary of this major lawsuit filed against several members of the cabinet and, like I said, police organizations as well. Now, we've reported on the statement of claim and the lawsuit itself, but for someone who's not legally trained, when they look at this document, there's a lot of information. So, what is it that you want Canadians to know about this major lawsuit filed against Justin Trudeau and several important institutions and figures?
Well, as we kind of had noted early on in the summary of the pleadings, was that the events in this action constitutes one of the largest and most egregious collective breaches of charter rights in the history of Canada. And the reason why we've named a number of different individuals is that I've been Eddie's lawyer since February 2020, when this all began. So we have a pretty in-depth knowledge of what went on, what took place, what led to the invocation of the Emergencies Act, what powers were granted to the financial institutions, and how that all came about. And when we look at this and essentially how it did come about, there were a number of parties at play, and a number of different factors that led into this. And one of it, I submit, would be the complicitness of the banks involved in this, and how that they gladly went along with this. And what your audience should understand is what the economic order gave. So the invocation of the Emergencies Act occurs. Okay, so the government invokes the Emergencies Act. Then what came out of it were the emergency measures regulations, and there was also the economic order that came out. And what the economic order gave was the banks and the police essentially powers to conduct what's called a warrantless search and seizure of people's accounts. So typically, if you want to see somebody's bank accounts, or you want to kick the door in someone's house, you need a warrant. Typically, there's a few exceptions, but typically you would need a warrant, and that has some neutral oversight built into the mechanism for doing so. So, for example, in say a drug trafficking case, you would have someone would swear an ITO and information to obtain. It would contain details, and they would go before a judge or justice of the peace, and they would sign off on it and get the authority to go and do that. There's some neutral oversight in the process. What this did, the way the economic order was built and crafted, is it usurped the power of the judiciary. It removed all of that, and basically you had the banks and the police officers becoming the judge, jury, and executioner whose bank accounts get frozen. At one point we highlight in the pleadings here and in the economic order itself is that the banks had this ongoing obligation to determine whose accounts to freeze. Who from the bank? What nameless, faceless banking entity has the power to just seize and freeze people's bank accounts, and then also share all of that information with the police? So what we had is the state become this massive apparatus over the financial institutions, the police, and the government of Canada, all as one massive government actor in doing so. And we submit that the intelligence that led to the invocation of the Emergencies Act was entirely faulty and entirely circular, the reasoning that got there, because all of the typical intelligence networks that the government of Canada and cabinet would usually rely upon all stated that there was nothing in the Freedom Convoy or the Ottawa protests which would lead to a national security concerns that would warrant invoking the Emergencies Act. And that was CSIS reports, police reports, RCMP reports on the ground, the normal intelligence sets that you would have. None of them indicated that the protests were a national security or a threat to national security. And I'm sure we'll get into some of this further, but Cabinet took it a step further and invoked, or essentially Ms. Jody Thomas, started her own open source intelligence reporting. And what that was relied upon and predicated upon was basically social media accounts using that. And what we've uncovered and found is that a lot of it links back to government-funded networks that were doing this. So you have a completely closed circle where the intelligence that they're relying upon is the intelligence they're creating. That creates obvious problems when you're doing intelligence gathering. There's nothing neutral about that. And so when the government couldn't get the intelligence they needed to invoke the Emergencies Act, they relied on their own open source project to do so as the means and the justification for doing it, which was using a number of sources that were at one point or are, we don't know, we'll uncover the full truth of that, funded by the government of Canada, which is obviously problematic.
Yeah, and so that's where the Canadian Anti-Hate Network comes into this, right? That's why Bernie Farber has been listed as a defendant in this case.
Correct.
Okay, so that it was Canadian Anti-Hate Network, basically their intelligence or their access to information that was what Jody Thomas relied on. Because I know in the filing, there's a large section about this Jody Thomas open source intelligence. So that was basically that was using Anti-Hate Network information.
Anti-hate network information and others. So we will. That's why we have left John Doe and ABC Corp open, so when we can uncover the full, true extent of it. And Ms. Thomas admitted herself that she was conducting these open source investigations, intelligence investigations, essentially. There's no real authorization for that, and that is not representative of the government-wide intelligence at the time. You got to look at this at the time. We can't go back and recreate the record. At the time, the intelligence reporting was largely consistent. This was not a threat to the national security of Canada. And when the government of Canada decided to embark on their own open source intelligence investigation to circumvent and bypass that, essentially in a closed circle, that's highly problematic. That's highly problematic because it seems like what it appears from the knowledge that we have is that they're trying to force the protest to look like something it necessarily wasn't, or highly exaggerated one-sided reporting on it when that wasn't the view of the intelligence on the ground, and on people who were fully trained in this, and in departments that were fully trained in this, and the normal sources that you would pull from it. And we find that is deeply, deeply troubling and concerning. Especially if the government of Canada had knowledge specifically that the information they were relying upon was grossly exaggerated, one-sided, and biased, and still went ahead and invoked the Emergencies Act anyways on the basis of that intelligence that ran contrary to what CSIS was telling them, what the RCMP was telling, what the actual government-wide viewpoint was at the time. And to our mind, that speaks to misfeasance of public office. That speaks to misfeasance of public office to do so. And elected officials represent Canadians and Canadian people and need to act in good faith when they're making these decisions.
Absolutely. Now, back to you, Eddie. Now, you've been making the rounds on doing interviews and speaking engagements. That's where I met both of you in Washington, D.C. But I want to ask about the legacy media, the mainstream media in this country. You're a lead plaintiff in this case. You're a veteran. You think that your story would be compelling for the mainstream media. Now, has the mainstream media reached out to you to have your story told and to explain to Canadians why you're embarking on this civil suit?
Simple answer is no.
Not surprising, I'm afraid. Yeah. And so obviously we know that the legacy media have been taking money from the federal government. That they were extremely biased in their coverage throughout the Freedom Convoy. But do you think that this speaks to a larger problem and a larger reason as to why Canadians no longer trust the legacy media?
Yeah, I think, they should have stepped up and told the true story of what was happening. They should have done some reporting and some after-action follow-up. They just didn't do any of it. I've never been spoken to by anyone from mainstream media in any way. They've not tried to engage a conversation at all. And I think it's to their, it says a lot to their integrity to get to the truth of a story. And they just haven't done it.
And I'm guessing that it doesn't appear as though they've had much coverage on this civil lawsuit either, Blair. It seems as though that's not something they're too inclined to cover.
We've had a little bit of coverage on it, but certainly not as much as independent media has. CTV, to their credit, CTV National did do a coverage piece of it. The Toronto Star did as well, to their credit for that. So, but certainly not as much as you'd expect. I mean, ignoring the quantum or the dollar amount, I think we've made it a very realistic amount that we are seeking. And for a number of people, it's not about the money for a number of the plaintiffs, and Eddie will tell you that. It's about holding governments to account for their wrongdoing. And to my mind, I would think that this should be something that mainstream media should want to be interested in, because charter rights affect all of us. Our values as Canadians are not political. What we stand for is not a political thing. It's not a left or a right thing. This should interest people from all walks of life, all different backgrounds, from people we agree with, people we disagree with. This is the government of the day that did this. But there could be future governments, different governments in power with different leanings that could look to this. And we want them to know that you can't do this to Canadian citizens. You can't do this to people. This is not what has made Canada so amazing for so long, and what has made our country really a bastion of light in the world. and are upholding freedom, the rule of law, those type of democratic values that we really hold near and dear. We are part of the Western civilization, and Canada plays an important role in Western civilization, and upholding those values that we really do cherish as Canadians. And to my mind, I would think that the mainstream media and all Canadians would be interested in this. And hopefully there is more coverage on it. This is something that is about upholding the rule of law and upholding charter rights. It's not really about the money for doing it. Really, if this was solely about the money for people like Eddie and I, we wouldn't be doing this. The amount we've had to endure and been through to do all of this and to be here. It's very important that we hold governments to account. And, from my perspective, this was an obligation to do, to go forward with it. It felt like something I absolutely had to do once I got to know Eddie's story and Vincent at the federal court challenge, and knowing the type of man that Eddie is. I had to do it. I absolutely had to do it. I felt obligated to do it. I like Canada. I love this country. I love Canada. I love being an Albertan as well. And I love what this country has given me. I had a very humble upbringing, humble roots to be able to in the position I'm in now. And it's a large credit to the society I got to grow up and live in. And I want to preserve that for my children and for the next generations. And this fight between citizens and government, it feels, because we are in the moment, it feels like it is unprecedented. And it is, in terms of using the financial tools they can. But there's always that pull between governments and its citizens, and governments overreaching. And citizens need to be engaged and to stand up and fight against it. And through the courts is one of the ways we can do it. Through our democratic processes and through the courts are ways that we can do this as citizens, that each generation always has to do to uphold what we have in the West.
Absolutely. And I think it's of course, a worthy fight, and one that is going to hopefully have some serious positive impact in our country. And so you spoke about your upbringing and your what has motivated you to do this. And Eddie, I want you to explain to our audience more about yourself and your story. You served our military for 22 years, I think it is. And so take us through why you wanted to serve this country, what motivated you to do that, and maybe some of the experiences that you had to go through representing our country.
Sure. I joined the military at a very young age. I was barely 18. I served 22 years. I did a tour overseas in Cyprus. I'm a recipient of the Medal of Bravery. I love this country. I signed a check basically that I'd die for this country if it was required. And the betrayal I felt from my government, that's very hard to put into words. And it's a betrayal of the highest order in my opinion. And, like I said at the beginning, I've never been charged with a crime. I haven't committed a crime. And yet they treated me as if I was a criminal because I said something they didn't like. I don't understand that. It just doesn't resonate with me that why my government would attack me. And, the names I've been called a white supremacist, a Nazi, every name in the book. For what? I've never called anybody else any names. So why would they try to direct that type of hate towards me? I don't know. I don't think that's very, fair. And that's why I'm standing up, and that's why I'm doing what I'm doing, because we can't let governments do this to citizens because they say something that's contrary to their narrative. So I'm in this until the end. That's just my character. I never surrender, and I'll never turn back.
Absolutely. Now, I have to ask you some of the I wouldn't call it criticism, but some of the commentary on social media has been around, the idea that if you sue, the government and you sue figures in the government, that really, if they're found liable for the damages and the money gets paid out by the taxpayer, how do you guys respond to that? Because I have seen that on social media, and I want you to be able to explain this process and how it works, and especially, in reference to that criticism, which is if the government is found liable, if you guys win, the money comes out of the taxpayer.
Yeah, sure. I can respond to that. So we have sought personal liability for the members of cabinet. There is some case law that's ongoing that does demonstrate that that elected members can be held liable for unconstitutional legislation, particularly ones that are of a draconian nature. We are also seeking from the banks as well. So right. But ultimately, the Attorney General of Canada will represent a number of the defendants, and the court may apportion liability. That way, we can't control that. But if you look at it from a bigger perspective, cases like this are to hold governments account, and that's why we put a very reasonable quantum at it. Is to hold governments account for this. And if you look at it, how much we are actually seeking in damages relative to the amount of government waste that we have seen, particularly from this Liberal government of Canada. It's very minimal, all things considered, when you actually think about it. But more importantly, though, is that what a lawsuit like this does is it puts governments on notice that we cannot just trample on people's rights. And I mean that literally, because that literally happened. People were literally trampled by horses here. And these types of lawsuits are very important, whether that gets paid by taxpayers, whether that gets apportioned personal liability as we have sought, or through the banks, or through the private corporate entities that we are seeking damages from. That's the court's decision to ultimately make. That's ultimately the court's decision to make. We have sought personal liability here. And the reason we did so, somewhat akin to like when in corporate law, when you have directors acting so abhorrently, you can do what's called piercing the corporate veil, where you go after them personally for their misconduct. You go after the directors personally, not the company, and which is what we are seeking ultimately, and there's something akin to it, to that, because we think it's important to have, and whether we are successful in that, again, that'll be for the courts to determine and apportion liability for it. But we are seeking personal liability. We are seeking indemnity from the banks and from the other individuals that were responsible for this. If ultimately it is a quote unquote paid for by the taxpayers, I wouldn't view it in that way.
Right.
We pay taxes for a number of things, and there's it really is, relatively speaking, considering the amount that we've seen this government waste. It is not a large amount on a relative scale for it. But again, that'll come down to the court to apportion liability. More importantly, this lawsuit should serve for a reminder for current and future governments that you cannot abuse your power. You cannot abuse your power and take away the rights of Canadians. We will oppose it. We will fight against it. The government of the day is the one who did this, and if future governments take similar actions, we will absolutely oppose it in the future. And it's important that Canadians do this. It's very important that Canadians do this, that Canadians have an ability to do this and have an ability to oppose this stuff, because in other parts of the world, opposing the government can get you kidnapped and shot, right? And in Canada, we have this ability to do this, to use peaceful democratic means to do this, and that's through court challenges, through using or voting, through municipal elections, through that we have very peaceful means to do it, and this is one of the peaceful means that we can do it, to hold governments to account for their wrongdoing, and that's what we're going to continue to do.
And I see it as though the taxpayers would win if you guys win, because they get protected and there's precedent that holds these governments to account. So I wanted to give you the opportunity to clear that, because I have seen that in some comments on social media about these ongoing cases. Also, I want to talk about the fact that some of the co-plaintiffs in this lawsuit weren't actually supporters of the Freedom Convoy, but were really, collateral damage due to these economic orders. Briefly, Blair, could you summarize some of those cases of people who had their bank accounts frozen, who suffered financial damage because of this, but were never actually supporting the convoy to begin with?
Yeah, so there's two in particular that we should turn to. So one is Kathleen Marco and her son Timothy Thiessen. So Kathleen's her ex common law spouse went down to the Ottawa protests. She opposed it. She didn't even go. She was against the Freedom Convoy, against the protest, did not go. But her husband went down. And he got his bank account frozen, but there was still some joint accounts that were ongoing. So she had her bank account frozen by her credit union. Her son, young Timothy Thiessen, Timmy, he was a 17-year-old kid working in a kitchen, just trying to make a living, trying to get by, certainly living paycheck to paycheck, blue collars, like normal Canadian. Again, opposed the Freedom Convoy, didn't even support it. He had his bank account frozen. Couldn't deposit the check from his work. Couldn't provide for himself. Couldn't live. And the lasting impact that has on people, like that's when you revisit this, like that, how far-reaching that was. That impacted people that were on the other side of the country, that in British Columbia, that completely opposed the very movement that got their accounts frozen. That should send chills up and down, Canadian spines, because we talk about, the extrajudicial killings that can happen in other parts of the world here. But in many ways, if people are so dependent on their cards and they don't have cash, that's kind of like an extrajudicial financial killing, in the sense, like, you can't access money, you can't do anything, you can't pay for things. You can't put food on the table. You can't, like in Eddie's situation, he had to get cash from people just to get home. He's a veteran. He would have froze to death. It was very cold. Eddie would have froze to death in Ottawa at that time if people didn't give him some cash to get home. And thankfully, there were kind-hearted Canadians and there were kind people that were willing to give Eddie cash so he could get home, because that's who we are as Canadians. We help each other. We help people. We help our neighbors. We care about one another. We can put aside our political differences to care about one another and have values that we are so strongly entrenched in us that we uphold for everybody, and even those people we disagree with. And that's important about human rights work and Charter of Rights and Freedoms work, is that in particular, we should have people with different viewpoints that are fully supportive of this. You could have people who completely oppose the Freedom Convoy, completely oppose all of that, could still support this a lot because they say, I don't want to be next. I don't want this to happen to me. I don't want my bank accounts to be frozen without a warrant for something, for me exercising my constitutional rights when a new government of the day is in power. We don't want to go down that path of doing that towards people that the government views as political quote unquote enemies or not, or however they want to view them as. That's not Canada. That's not a Canada that Eddie fought for. Made sacrifices, won a Medal of Bravery for, to uphold, that my family has a very proud military service for the British Empire. They didn't make those sacrifices to do that, to live in a country where we can do that, where our government can do that. Governments are accountable to the people.
Right.
And that is something we really want to uphold. And Eddie and I have talked about this at length, and it's something we're fully committed to. Absolutely.
And Eddie, obviously this has shaken your confidence in government and institutions. Now, if you are successful, do you think that a future government, do you worry that a future government in this country, regardless of the outcome of this case, might, do this again somehow? I am sure that as someone who served this country, you have a significant, this is taking a serious hit on how you view the government, how you view our institutions in this country. What do you see as the future of this country, especially now that you've been treated this way by the government?
Well, I've lost a lot of faith for our country. I really have. I'm hoping, that faith will be restored through actions that, will come down in the future. But, for any government after this government to do anything like that, I think would be a grave mistake. And that's why we have to do this. I have very limited trust for the banks. I don't keep money in there now other than just to pay the bills. I'm not trusting a government. I'm very careful how I interact. I'm very careful how I interact with police after what they demonstrated, what they're willing to do and what they said, what took place in Ottawa. So, I tend to look over my shoulder a lot more than I ever would have. And I don't think that's something that I can quantify into words, that feeling that you have that you're constantly being watched. Are they going to put something in my path that will destroy my life at any moment just because they can? I'm just a regular guy. I'm just a retired man that, just wants to live his life and be free. And yet my government wants to overreach and, push you into doing things that really in a free society you should never have to experience. So
absolutely.
I hope I get that trust back one day.
Absolutely. And for Canadians who want to help in any way they can, I'm not quite sure how they can, but how can Canadians get involved if they want to get involved in this, and if they want to help out? I guess, Blair, you could answer that question.
Yeah, we can pass that one off to Eddie. I think you've got some stuff with the
Yeah.
Accountability Project that might be good for you. Good point for you to touch on.
Absolutely, yeah.
Sure. For you. The Accountability Project, it's tapcan.org, tapcan.org. All of the information's on there. You can see all of the documents that we have from the courts, as well as our upcoming actions, and it gives some directions on how you can donate. And if you'd like to get involved, we really appreciate it. TAP is a separate organization, and it's to help with funding for these types of lawsuits. And it's an overwhelming task, and the costs are great to pursue this type of thing. So we're hoping Canadians get involved and will help donate.
Absolutely. And we'll have a link to TAPCAN in the description of this video, as well as a link to the filing, the statement of claim, which I encourage every Canadian to read and read closely because it is something that is extremely important. Eddie and Blair, thank you both so much for coming on.
Awesome. Thank you, Harrison. And just put a final word out to your audience is please just educate yourself. Educate yourself. Learn about our history. Learn about the Charter. Learn about the freedoms you have. Those freedoms are something that are worth fighting for, are worth standing up for. And really, an informed population is what makes democracies work. And an informed, educated population are what make our society what it is, what it has the potential to be, and allowing us to use peaceful democratic means to continue to uphold the values that Eddie has served his country very proudly for. And thank you for the opportunity, Harrison. I was really honored to meet you there in Washington. You give me hope for the future of journalism. You're a very bright young man, and just keep doing what you're doing.
Well, thank you so much. And Eddie, thank you again. Thank you for your service. Blair, thank you for what you're doing.
Thank you, Harrison.
Really appreciate both of you guys coming on.
Really
Thanks,
appreciate it.